When people come to be part of a spiritual community, whether it's a UU or another, there's often a sense of something they'd like to add or shift in their lives. Yes, we gather for community and connection, but there's something else that draws us as well. I think for many, it's the longing to experience peace, peace within ourselves and in the world around us. Most religious and spiritual traditions imply that that kind of peace, that inner peace, is possible. Many of us at times have a glimpse of it, but if we're honest, we'll often notice how quickly that experience of inner peace can be interrupted. And if we happen to pause and look at what's triggering that feeling to change, we may realize that what's impacting, what's diminishing our sense of peace may not so much be what's happening outside of us as much as what's happening inside of us. For several years, I had the pleasure of studying meditation with this astounding yogi. Her name is Rudrani Furman, and she's the founder of the World Yoga Center in New York. It's the oldest existing yoga center. And she's a powerhouse of spirituality and wisdom, and she's now close to 90, and she is still teaching meditation and yoga. And in our trainings, what Rudrani often referred to is something she called the inner critic, which is not just her term, but a term that psychologists use to identify that critical voice that resides in us. And she would share that we all have one. It's part of the mind that evaluates, judges, and comments, and it happens automatically. From a psychological perspective, this voice often develops early, and it could be shaped by family, culture, expectations, or even trauma. And it's often internalized, and over time, it simply begins to feel like it's simply who we are. From a Buddhist perspective, you may say that it's part of the conditioned mind. It's mind patterns that arise. They're not because they're true, but because they've been repeated. The challenge of this inner critic is that it doesn't just shape how we relate to ourselves, but it can shape how we relate to everything. You know this inner critic, right? It's that voice that can turn a perfectly normal interaction into an inner dialogue of discomfort. Have any of you had any of these moments in your life? I know most of us have. And it could be triggered by something that actually is triggering, or somebody might just say, have a nice day, and by bedtime you're saying to yourself, what do they really mean by that? Have a nice day. The thing about this inner critic is that if we don't become mindful or aware of it, it can impact how we see not just ourselves, but how we see people and situations around us. It may lend us to be more judgmental, less patient, and quicker to jump to conclusions. For human beings, learning to make peace with our inner discomfort, darkness, or suffering is part of the lifelong struggle that we all face. Many religious thinkers and theologians suggest that this struggle deeply shapes how we understand and how we could look at the stories and mythology that we find in religions. So I'd like to take a moment and explore two familiar religious stories through the lens of this inner critic or inner struggles that impact our experience of being human. So first, I'd like to refer to what is often called the temptation of Christ. It is the time that Jesus spent in the wilderness. And for those of you that might not be aware of this story, I'm going to paraphrase it. So it's said, or it's written in the Gospels, or in a few of the Gospels, that after Jesus' baptism, he spent 40 days in the desert where he fasted and was repeatedly tempted and challenged by what was understood as the devil. So this gospel story is widely interpreted by both theological and psychological scholars as an archetype for the human struggle with that inner critic. Perhaps that demon, or that one that challenged Jesus, wasn't outside him, but perhaps inside him. It's often understood as a universal narrative of the internal battle of confronting our own inner demons. How many of you are familiar with the story of Siddhartha becoming the Buddha? Can you raise your hand if you are? How many of you? Yes. Well, many of you might know or remember the story of how Buddha was met by, how Siddhartha was met by Mara. And I'm going to share a little of that story for you who might not be familiar. So Siddhartha was the son. He was born a prince, a son of a king, and a soothsayer came to his father at the time of his birth and told his father that your son will either be a great spiritual leader or a great king. The father wanted to ensure that he was a great warrior king. Warrior king was the word. He wanted him to have that edge. He didn't want his heart to be opened and softened. So the father raised Siddhartha in a way that he could not be exposed to anything of any form of suffering. He never saw death. He never saw aging. He never saw illness. He essentially was in a bubble. The day came where he was inadvertently exposed to suffering when he left the inner kingdom area. And he left then, with seeing this, he ended up leaving his family, leaving his kingdom, and became a wandering ascetic, undergoing intense fasting and self-discipline. Until one day, this went on for years, he came to sit under a Bodhi tree, and he committed himself to not leave this spot until he experienced an awakening, until he became awakened, until he became enlightened. And as he sat under this tree, he was met by Mara, the great demon personification of desire, fear, ego, and death. And Mara approached him with his army of demons. And he offered Siddhartha many temptations, which he refused and fought against. And finally, Mara and his army showered Siddhartha with arrows. But rather than experiencing anger or fear, Siddhartha's response to Mara was, I see you. I see you. And in doing that, the arrows that were shot, this army of arrows, turned into flowers and drifted to the earth around Siddhartha. It was then that he was awakened and he became the Buddha. And Buddha is a word that actually means awakened one. When the Buddha was met by Mara, the change happened when he said, I see you. Mara was an illusion, and that illusion diminished only when being seen. For we humans, this can work for us in the same way. Becoming aware of the part of us that is the critic, the joy, the judge, the inner darkness, the awareness minimizes its power over us. Let me say this again. When we witness what's going on within us, when we look straight into the awareness of the darkness within us, it loses its grip over us. It minimizes its power. Its illusion is its power. Its illusion is the power to wound, to create pain or separation. Awareness is the tool, the gift that gives us choice. There's an interesting balance in how we impact ourselves and the world around us. There's often, we'll find, the same energy flowing in two directions. If we are deeply critical of ourselves, we will be deeply critical of others. If we are critical of others, we will become critical of ourselves. It's the same energy, like the flow of a river. It cannot be separated. We'll also find that when we become benevolent, when we come at ourselves with compassion, we will innately become more compassionate for people around us and the world around us, and vice versa. This reciprocity is part of the equation of the human experience. Behind me is a sign. You can see this right here. It says the way out is in. Many of you have been to my house. It hangs by the front door. And many of you have joined me, and we visited Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery. This is where it's from, on a field trip. I think this statement is relevant for what we're talking about today. We live our lives often thinking that the events in our lives around us are the direct cause of our happiness. Yet, sages and psychologists invite us to consider if we shift our inner story or response to the events of our lives with awareness, our lives can change. The invitation is that we are not victims of our emotions, that we can actually change them from the inside out. Now, I'd like to be realistic. It doesn't mean that this inner critic or this wrestling within us disappears. We are human, and part of being human is to wrestle. The inner critic will show up in our lives, but with awareness, it does not have the same authority. Oh yes, there was something a little more to that story of the Buddha and Mara. It seems that as the years went on, Mara did not give up on the Buddha. Though the Buddha was enlightened, Mara was not discouraged, and Mara continued to make unexpected appearances. But instead of ignoring Mara, or trying to kill Mara, or driving him away, the Buddha would calmly acknowledge his presence and say, "I see you, Mara," and would invite him in for tea. Serve him tea as if he was a guest. And then Mara would stay for a few moments and just give up and leave. So in closing, I leave you with this. May we be gentle with ourselves in the lifelong wrestling of being human. May we remember that awareness itself is sacred, and that compassion begins not after we become perfect, but right in the middle of our struggle. And may we have the courage and compassion to invite our own demons to tea. May it be so. If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.